The second camp of conceptualism is the critique camp. Again, political and institutional. So, some artists I want to show you here, we'll start off with Hans Hacke, who is a German artist. One of the things you'll notice that I'd mentioned when we started looking at 20th century art is, of course, it'll get more and more global. So, you'll see a lot of artists in this conversation that come from all different places across the globe. So, Hacke is German, and that will figure in a bit into what we're discussing with him as well. And Hacke, he was famous for doing works that use systems. So his kind of conceptualism to me is a critique of different kinds of systems, right? But he starts out just thinking about how systems work. And so one of his early works you see here that he built was a condensation cube that literally showed you how the process of, condensation works, right? The flow of water, right, through its different phases, right? Its different, cycles, right? So he really thought about this idea of systems. He did works where he actually watched, like, ducks moving around a pond. He'd sit on the side of a pond, right, a lake, right, and he would watch ducks moving around all day, and he would chart, like, their movements, and then he would make these abstract what look like abstract drawings, right, but really were, again, functions of the movements, right, the systems. And one of my favorite pieces he did was that he had a gallery show where he just had a poll question on the wall. It was a question like, do you approve of the president's, dealings in this political matter? Yes or no? And the show was basically people taking the quiz, right? Taking the poll question. And there was two different glass boxes where you put either yes, I approve or like no, I don't approve, right? And at the end of that, he basically then took the results and sort of broke that out as a graph, right? He then also did a side quiz where he asked people like about the demographics of who came to galleries, right? So one of the shows he did was like, basically just fill out these cards about like, I'm female, I'm white, between the ages of 35 and 45, right? That kind of thing. And then he did a show where he just put up graphs of the demographics of who came to galleries. And, again, trying to get into the system of like who actually partakes in art. Many people suggest that Haka was one of the first people that made gallerists think about how there was a lack of diversity of people who actually came to see art, right? It was mainly like upper class, rich white people, So, how do you speak to diversity within systems, let's say? How do you get different groups of people to come see art? So many people say Haka kind of helped museum management kind of look at how do you diversify, right? How do you get more people to come in and see what you're showing to them? He also made conceptual works that were about challenging, the systems of power that were in place. This is a famous work he did for the Guggenheim Museum. The Guggenheim is a very famous, modern and contemporary art museum in New York. And so if you have a show at the Guggenheim, it's kind of a big deal. He was asked by the Guggenheim to do a show and was given no directive really about what to do, just do something, right? So when he came in to present his show, he had these pictures of buildings, like you see here, and then below them, like text. And so the museum curators and the board were like, well, what is this? And so they started looking closer at the boards, right, and reading them and realized that it's a real estate that basically was being held by a lot of the board members on the Guggenheim Museum's board. And many of these were slums. So the board members start to realize that these are all buildings that they own, and they're buildings that they probably wouldn't be proud to say that they own if they had to say so in public, right? So they're like, "Well, what is this?" And he's like, "Well, it's basically showing you your real estate holdings. It's a clinical look at, what you actually hold as real estate holders, right?" But of course, in his mind, he's like, "Well, I'm also outing you as slumlords." So, of course, I'm sure you know that the Guggenheim Museum board did not allow this show to be shown, but later the Pompidou Center in Paris will show it, so don't worry, it got shown. But, what he's doing with this kind of conceptualism is he's critiquing the kind of people who are running museums and saying, well, what are their priorities? What do they actually care about people or do they care about their money? And if you know anything about boards, it's usually wealthy people. It's usually not people who know anything about anything. Like I always laugh about the board of our school, where a lot of them don't have any experience in education whatsoever. And I'm like, why are you on the board of my school? Like, it makes no sense to me, But again, that's how things work. If you're a captain of industry, you get to run things. So, you know, Hawk is kind of poking a bit here at the institution and saying, "Who are you? Let's rip off that mask in Scooby Doo fashion and show people, who you really are." There's something quite brilliant about it. And here's another work he did for the Met in New York. It was a critique of the Met and the kind of shows that they were doing. So you'll notice it's called Metro Mobilitan. It's a play on Metropolitan Museum of Art, right? This is the Met in New York. And the Met was going to do a show on ancient Nigerian art, right? You'll see like the kind of banners that they use in museums, like the treasures of ancient Nigeria, supported by a grant by Mobile, right? But you'll see the quotes on the other side about, Mobile's position on working with African nations that often were inflicting great harm on their people, that they were run by dictators or paramilitaries. And Mobile's like, well, we can't really deny a supply of our oil, our gas, right, to these police forces. We're in those countries, right? That wouldn't be responsible citizenship. Where Hawk is trying to say, you're propping up people that are killing other people, right? All because you want the gas, right? You want the oil. That's what you want. And you're trying to cloak it behind, well, we can't really resist, what's going on as far as the leadership here. So he's once again critiquing what's on the surface and what's deep underneath, what people show you, and then what are their real motivations. Again, this was a show that wasn't shown in America, obviously, but was shown in Paris again at the Pompidou Center. The French love anything controversial, right? Um, this is the work he did for the Venice Biennale. Now, a note on the Venice Biennale, right? It is a very important show in the art world. And it's an invitation show where people are invited to represent their country. So to be invited to represent your country is a really big deal. And so he was invited to represent Germany in 1993, Hans Haacke. And again, we'll see different artists at the Biennale as we go on through the rest of our lectures. So again, don't forget about the Venice Biennale. It's a big thing for artists. This is the work he did in the German pavilion, and all the countries who participate in the Venice Biennale all have permanent pavilions. It's part of the Biennale structure. And you'll notice what he did for his piece is he broke up the floors inside the pavilion. These marble floors, he broke them up and wrote on the wall Germania. Why did he do this? The pavilion was actually built during the time of Hitler, right, during Nazism in Germany. And so he said he wanted to break up the remnants of the remaining Germanic, right, push, right? He wanted to break up the remnants of this Nazi relic, as he put it, destroy it, right, essentially, and not have it have any sway. And so he just busts up these beautiful marble floors as a note on, I will tear this Nazi history down, even if it seems like it's nothing harmful. Maybe it is. Maybe we need to consider that. Also wanted to show you some works related to Silda Morales, one of my favorite artists. He's a Brazilian, and he comments a lot on the Brazilian political situation in the 60s and 70s, which was quite tumultuous. We'll look a little bit more at his political works, right, and when we get into installation art. But he starts off thinking very conceptually about how do you critique, right? How do you critique an institution? And he was thinking a lot about like, capitalism, right? Consumerism. And so he started doing these works he called insertions into ideological circuits. Ideology is how we think, right? Ideology, right? It's how we think. And he says, I'm trying to insert things into those circuits, right? Or those pathways to disrupt how you think, right? To make you change how you think. And because he was a young artist at this time, this is sort of the 60s moving into the 70s, he didn't have a lot of money. So he said, I tried to pick things that I could get my hands on quite easily and that I could also get back into other people's hands quite easily. So something like a Coke bottle at this time. Coke bottles were recycled. You took them back to the store and they'd sanitize them, right? And then they would refill them and then they'd go back out. So he would stamp messages on them. He also did this with money, where he'd stamp messages on money because he knew that money would change hands, right, from various hands to the other. And these messages were things like the insertions into ideological circuits, stamping, and things like Yankees Go Home, which was his sort of commentary on American involvement, right, in South American and Central American economies, right, and how many people didn't agree with that. So again, he's looking at things that are very available and how he can use those things to speak to a larger framing of people and critique the institutions that were in place in a way that is very powerful because again, it's not about going to a gallery and looking at a painting. It's an object coming into your hands and disrupting your thinking, right? Disrupting you from what you were sort of thinking about. He also did works he called the Zero Sum Project, where he would take money, in this case, like the dollar bill, and he would use it to say it's not worth anything, and change the symbolism on it, right? The imagery on it. So George Washington becomes Uncle Sam and things like this. This was kind of dealing with American aggression, as he put it. He didn't like the idea of America's involvement in Brazilian politics or even South American politics in general, and would use these works to critique that. This is Daniel Buren, and where I always joke that Weiner and Kossuth used language, Buren uses form because all he ever used was these stripes, mainly the blue and white motif. That became really his signature calling card. But what I think he does is he uses form, right, to disrupt and to critique. So he went around in his early days, sort of using the public spaces, right, to show you these stripes, right, as a way of like, well, what is art anyway? What is this disruption of what is art that you expect to see and where do you expect to see it? Because let's face it, you don't expect to see art just walking down the street in an abandoned storefront. And I don't think most people look at stripes and think it's art, right? So he's like, well, how can I challenge you about like what you think our art should be, where it should be seen, and then the kind of form it should inhabit? So he's made a whole career of this, right? Using form as a point of disruption. Here's his show in the Guggenheim where he literally just hung this giant panel right down through the middle of the Guggenheim, right? Challenging the idea of how you use the space, what you show in the space. So this is where I get into like real institutional critique. And again, he's really made a name for himself with this. Daniel Buren is French, so here he is at the Petit Palais in Paris, right? The Petit Palais is often used as a public art site. So here are the columns that he did for the Petit Palais, right? And people taking their pictures on them and such. Here he is at the Venice Biennale, right, in 1985, representing France. And here's Art Basel a couple years ago where he did an escalator, right, with the stripes. So you notice the blue and white stripes are kind of his thing. And again, it really questions form, subject matter, right, presentation, right, institutional sort of understanding of how to present this stuff. I have a funny story from when I was in grad school doing my master's. I went to the University of Arizona, and we have a really nice art gallery for a university, right? And I heard a story from one of the curators about they had done a conceptual show, and Buren had put a piece on one of the walls in the gallery, and so the curators were like, "Look, after the show's over, we're going to keep the Buren, right? We're just going to keep it." And we'll prepare the rest of the spaces to go back to use some other usage, right, or some other show coming in. Well, when the people that came in to paint the gallery, because they're just like, you know, painters, like they don't know. They actually painted over the Buren, and the gallerists were like, "Oh my God, the Buren!" Like, but it's a funny story about how like everyday people are like who don't have a lot of art background are like, "Well, what? It was stripes." And the art curators are like, no, it was a Buren. Like, oh God, no. So again, it shows you how, we look at form and how we think about form as artistic, right, is very different from your perspective of what you know about art history and what you know about conceptualism. The final artist I'm going to show you is Piero Manzoni, an Italian artist who literally thumbed his nose at art. So I always love this photo. I think it's a great way to introduce Manzoni. And used his conceptualism, I think, to really critique institutions of art making. He's famous for his artist shit, which is basically what it sounds like, right? So people bought this, right, as a conceptual piece of art. This goes very Duchamp. You'll notice, right, the artist's breath. So you can go back to the Paris Air, right, from Duchamp and think about that a little bit. And of course, his famous living sculptures, right? So again, how do you own it? How do you collect it? Manzoni would be like, you can't. That's not the point. That's not the point of conceptualism at all. Which segues into something that happened last year, which I'm sure you all heard about if you like art at all, or if you just like, being on social media. Maurizio Catalan's Comedian, which appeared at the Art Basel Miami show and was basically a banana taped to a wall. This caused a furor, right, in the art community. And I remember friends of mine being like, what in the heck is this? Can you explain this to me? And I'm like, sure, it's conceptual art. And they were like, well, why? Why is this art? And I'm like, because he says so, right? That's all it takes. It's because he said so, right? And the rejection of that by people, that because you say something's art, it's art. That is the core of what conceptualism is. Because you say it's art, it's art. That's all there is to it. And if you know anything about this piece, people bought editions of this. It went for like $1 million, I think, an edition. And then a performance artist actually came along and then ate the banana, right? So again, when we start talking about performance, you can think about how conceptualism can become performance, right? And the sort of boundaries between the two ideas of conceptualism and performance, and how you can take the banana, eat it, and transform it into performance art.